Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems. It's our first episode of season 3, and this season we're looking at relationships across the lifespan. And today we are talking about our first relationship with our parents. And Dr. Kathleen Smith is joining us again. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hello, good to be here.
Glad you're here. I'll do your bio. Kathleen is a licensed therapist and a writer who lives in Washington, D.C. Her books include Everything Isn't Terrible and True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop Pleasing Others and Start Being Yourself. She is also a faculty member at the Bowen Center and the author of the popular newsletter, The Anxious Overachiever, which I refer clients to on the daily, as the kids say. Refer to it many times. So thanks for being here. You get to start with, I think when you were here last, your elevator pitch was 10 words or less maybe. So did you do that again or?
I've got 4 words.
Wow, even better.
What? Dixie, I don't think you said the topic.
I said parents.
Oh, okay.
Really, our relationship with our parents. Yeah.
My pitch doesn't include your relationship with your parents. That's sort of implied, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So my pitch for your relationship with your parents and or caregivers is Olympic training for objectivity is what I came up with. Would you like me to elaborate or would you?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think about, there's this great quote in the book, Family Evaluation by Kerr and Bowen, where Dr. Kerr wrote, objectivity about one's parents promotes objectivity about oneself. And I love it. It's such a succinct quote. And I think it's so important to think about it is your relationship with your parents or caregivers is often the hardest place to be objective about people's functioning. It's easy to be overly positive or overly negative, right?
Right.
Whether they're alive or dead. And so, just the work of getting a little bit more objective about their functioning, I think it's true. I think it does lend itself to not being overly positive or overly negative about yourself and your own challenges. So I was going to say CrossFit for objectivity, but CrossFit's like a little culty, right? So that's it's not differentiated. So I came up with Olympic training instead. So
I love
Perfect.
it. I love it.
Yeah.
It makes me feel, much more motivated about the work if I'm Olympic training.
Get the theme playing in the background.
There you go. Which is such a good segue, because in my pitch, I've been singing Sweet Caroline all morning in my head, because my pitch for our relationship with our parents is where it began. I think, this is the relationship that sets up other relationships in your life, and it sets up our nervous systems. I think there's a lot of research to show that the relationship with our caregivers sets up our nervous systems. And I think the part that I would add to emphasize Bowen theory is it's not just a one-to-one relationship. I think I want to emphasize it's a relationship not just with your mother or your father or your parent, it's their relationship with their parents, and that multi-generational process that begins and sets up in you how you're going to relate in the world. So I think that if everyone is now singing Sweet Caroline in their head, I have done my job. Dixie.
Right. Yeah, mine, I was thinking of some of the catchphrases from Bowen theory, and one of them is the stadium view of looking beyond the individual or one relationship and seeing the broader relationships and their moves across time. And then the other one is the phrase, what is a person up against in, a particular circumstance or relationship. And so my pitch kind of looks at those ideas, those phrases, thinking about parents and ducks. So we're going to think about ducks, not like any biology of ducks, just ducks. When I think of parents, I think of ducks on water, and they may look still on the surface, but underneath their feet are moving like crazy. Yes. And so I don't think kids maybe get an accurate picture of either the stillness or the fancy footwork. Some kids see the surface duck, others might see more of the crazy feet. So stadium view means knowing the facts, of events, changes, challenges in both our family and in the world when we were kids, and also maybe when our parents were kids, to get that broader view of what our parents were up against. And I think Bowen theory is a really useful framework for putting lots of those pieces together, because our childhood is like the water we swim in, and it's, like you guys are describing, it's hard to see it. So Bowen theory is helpful to get that broader perspective on how people function.
Dixie,
So
you started off the season with a Katie length pitch.
I know. Oh, yeah. That's okay. I love your pitches, Katie. From Dr. Bowen, Family Therapy and Clinical Practice, the triangle between self and parents is the most important primary triangle in life, and the one in which a person develops the triangle relationship patterns that remain relatively fixed in all relationships. Also from the Murray Bowen Archives Project from 1968, for many years, I have been on the thesis that a person can neither hate nor over-revere a parent if they really know their parents. I insist that if you really get to know a parent as a person, instead of as an angel or a devil, then you cannot either hate or sanctify them. How can you really hate someone you've never really known? Do you know what your mother was going through at the time you were born? Well, why in the world didn't you ever ask or try to find out? I don't know if that was his tone. Do you make a policy of hating people without really knowing facts? And then Ron Richardson's book, Family Ties That Bind. None of us really has a choice about whether to deal with our families or not. Even choosing not to deal with them is a way of dealing with them. You can't be free of your early experiences by denying their significance or ignoring them. Your early experiences are bound to repeat in your present life with different characters and in different contexts. So, yeah, those are some other pitches. What stands out in all of this?
Well, I think about, how do you not let the thinking about the triangle with your parents or, whatever caregivers were taking care of you be sort of a past thing, because people tend to get very blamey. With that sort of the classic sort of therapy trope of I go to therapy to, figure out how my mother screwed me up, right? Like
Yep.
Right.
our father or whatever. And so, I think of it as sort of like the past is important, but what present and future are also. And so how do you look to that primary triangle or what was happening in it? But also, how is it alive today? Not just in your other relationships, but like if your parents are living, like you are
right
there, that's an opportunity. So how do you not see it as fixed, right? And that it is like sort of like, I think what Bowen was getting at, how it is an opportunity, to move past that that hate or that sort of reverence or whatever. Because I think that's what people tend to do. They tend to learn about it and think about it and see themselves as sort of fixed that way, which I think is unfortunate when that happens.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the other part that I was feeling about being a little pushbacky about some of the statements is I don't know necessarily if you find it. I mean, I don't want to make it very Pollyanna that we're going to find out these facts about their parents and it's going to make the relationship automatically easier. I mean, you might find out stuff about your parents that might make you think, that was a pretty bad choice or that was not some great behavior. So I think kind of build off what you said, Kathleen, is I think it's just you're better informed to know the person as a person versus, just creating a trope of some kind that, how you project ideas on them. So that was my little one kind of pushback is I think I don't want, I think I see that sometimes in trainees where they'll come and they'll say, well, I talked to my client about knowing their parent better and they still hate their parent. And I think, we can still think about things that they did and not appreciate them. But I appreciate what you said, Kathleen, which is, but do you decide how you want to relate to them or if you want to relate to them or, knowing in theory, if you don't want to relate to them, how do you still stay in touch with the system?
Yeah. How do you make choices based on the reality?
Yeah.
But it's still a choice.
Yeah.
Do you want to think of some Examples?
I can go. I'll talk about myself because it's the most available example, right? My mother died when I was 19. And so sometimes I think, like, am I really mature, or have I only just had to deal with one parent? And that has its benefits and its costs, right? And I think about, it's an added challenge because it's a little harder to get factual about somebody who's no longer living, right? Because you can't just ask them. You have to go to other relationships to get the facts. But I also think, well, maybe I haven't had it too easy because I've had the experience of watching the other parent date people and be in romantic relationships, which if your parents have been married your whole life, you don't really get to see what that's like. And my dad wouldn't mind me picking on this example, but I think, just the experience of being on the outside of that is a workout, and seeing how somebody's functions in that arena in their life. It's very sobering,
Yeah.
that you might not see if your parents have been married for a long time. It might be a little more hidden, the intensity, let's say, not necessarily, but for me, that's been a really interesting workout to manage myself, in that new triangle that involves somebody, who's my dad. And I think my clients, the people I work with, seem to have more success when they are kind of moving into a phase of life with their parents or one of their parents. Let's say their parents are transitioning to a care home or something, right? And they can take that as an opportunity to say, "Ooh, here we go. What am I going to learn about myself? What am I going to learn about them as we move into this different phase of life?" Right? And I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier about your brain may be done cooking to some extent, when you're 25 or 30, but there's still all these chances to learn about maybe how that triangle functions, or just how a parent functions.
Yeah.
And that takes a little bit of the edge off, I think, because you're curious about it versus, oh God, here goes dad again, this is what's going to happen and how it's going to be a disaster. So it's an ongoing thing. And I think when people can have fun with it a little bit, not every situation is fun, but they get somewhere, maybe, like I said in my pitch, maybe a little bit faster than if they're just thinking about their boss,
right,
or their best friend. The allergicness is just so much more intense often.
Well, and you're highlighting it goes across the lifespan, right? Really, I mean, siblings probably is longer, but parents, you do get to see throughout the many, many different stages of life how challenges are met and different things show up. Yeah, Katie, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking what it made me think about, which it wasn't my example, but I think it's from Kathleen's, is the ability to relate to your parent at different ages. I was thinking about, there is advantages to a frontal lobe in the way that I experienced my parents at 15 or 16, and is quite different than the way that I experienced them in my late 40s, right? Like that there is this ability to have a different perspective. And so I think about some of the clients that I've worked with who can really, maybe who cut off from family, or who, only remember the parents that they had in their early 20s. And that's how they relate to them. And that's how they think about them. I think, Ron Richardson in his book, Family Ties That Bind, has such a beautiful example of a woman who, or maybe it's, I don't remember, woman or man, who goes back into their family system. And every time they talk about like that, the family reverts to behavior that they had when he was a teenager. And he would show up like a teenager, and he used to leave and get so frustrated that was not my intention, that I was going in there and I started being, pushing back on them and refusing to do things that when I walked away, I thought, why do I care about that? Like that old teenage self. And so I think, the ability to get interested in this, to be curious, even if how you can show up differently than maybe that teenage self, but definitely perspective. Yeah.
My prayer request at church before Christmas was, I'm going home to family. Can you pray I don't turn into a 12-year-old? Which people seem to resonate with that prayer request.
You could add for at least 36 hours. Keep it real.
What are the
Exactly.
realistic expectations of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can do my example.
Sure.
My example is tooth hygiene through the generations. I don't know if I was in my 30s or 40s, and I realized suddenly it occurred to me, oh, these teeth are going to be with me forever. And I had a lot of cavities as a child, and then you get into the needing crowns and all these things. And I got a little blamey of my parents. And then I look at my husband has good dental insurance, and I'm like, well, I send my kids for twice a year cleanings and all these things. And I was talking to my mom, and I didn't blame her in her presence, but I said, oh, I'm just so frustrated. I have all these things, all these fillings and things I'm needing taken care of. And she said, yeah, when I grew up, I don't think we owned a toothbrush. And I'm like, oh, Mom, I think you did pretty well with me. Knowing some of the story of your life, I'm like, wow, yes, we did not get taught to floss regularly, but that was different, So thinking about that objectivity, right? What was the dental guidelines?
Yeah, that things changed.
Yeah.
And that the ability to change through generations. And where is your perspective there? I think that example brought up for me, like, what is the perspective on me blaming my parents, but maybe finding a little knowledge of what they were equipped with in the home that they left from. Maybe.
Well, I think that, that gets back to, if you have the opportunity to observe how they function in the present, right? And to see the capabilities, then that's sort of the counter example to all the things you might be kind of bitter about in the past. It's really useful to have access to somebody who's trying to find their way through things, and to see that, I think it is harder to blame then.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other part I was thinking about with the shifting of the blame is, I find with clients and even myself, I find that when individuals have their own children, it's such an interesting shift in the perspective you have about the relationship with your own parents. And I think that can go different ways, but I think it is kind of a nodal event. Bowen theory will talk about when nodal events occurs, there potentially is a little more openness for the system to think about things in a different way. And I've watched that so often in clinical families that I work with, to just say, wow, this parenting thing is hard. And, that's one example that I think comes quite frequently. This parenting stuff is hard. And maybe I was a little hard on my parent, thinking about how they were trying to kind of pull this together. Or maybe some people saying, I'm finding that this is an important value or principle of mine. It could go the other way, that my parent didn't have. And how do you not hold on to the past? I think that's, I keep coming back to probably the same things that Kathleen started with, is just, I think so much energy is used in blame. And I just get interested with clients, and myself, about what is created if we don't put that energy into thinking about blaming our parents for what they did or didn't do in our lives. Got a little preachy there. Sorry.
Yeah, I had a quote from Jenny Brown, and she talks about much of our parents' reaction to each of their kids comes out of an unconscious effort to relieve their own uncertainties and anxieties, not from a deliberate attempt to mess up their children. And then she goes on to say that our parents come out of their own families with a level of tolerance for upset or discord or involvement in demands. Yeah, and I think you maybe don't always appreciate the humanity of your parents until you become also a parent who's a human being. Yeah.
I was thinking about when you work with clinical families, like, I think one of the things to talk about in this episode is cutoff, right? And when you work with an individual who chooses not to engage their family, how do you think with someone about that, where because they blame them for the way they were raised? I think that's a pretty big phenomenon nowadays, where people are blaming their parents for the wrongs that occurred in their childhood. And how do you think with a family member about that? Throwing out the question to you guys.
I think of, it's not that you don't talk about the cutoff, but I think it's also a matter of being curious about information that people don't have access to because of the cutoff, right? And so I think if I get too focused on seeing them having contact with the parent as the key, that's maybe not useful for them. But if I'm interested in questions about their parent that grandparents or aunts and uncles or cousins can answer, maybe that's a stepping stone to the contact, maybe it's not, right? But there are ways of getting more objective about people if you don't have contact with them. But if you do, it's a lot faster. So so I think, it's there are ways to be creative about it and to get people to think about, whether they have the contact or not. How is being more objective about a parent useful, again, for where they put their energy, right? Are they going to move out of that blaming piece a little bit more? And does that loosen things up or create the flexibility of not needing the cutoff?
Yeah.
Possibly, but possibly not. People can make their own choices based on the facts, but there are lots of ways to get people thinking about it, I think.
Yeah. Would you have something to add, Dixie?
Well, I was thinking, what does blame or anxiety filter out of what we see in our childhood or our relationship with our parents? Because we can go to the negative things, but also there's lots of strengths and resources that have grown in us.
Yeah, I think an example I always think about is I grew up as a latchkey kid. Both my parents worked and we kind of came home from school, got ourselves ready. And, I could see one option could be getting real bogged down and critical of my parents for not being available at those times after school where I might have wanted them. But, I'm developed a lot of responsibility. My siblings and I had a lot of fun. Got into a little bit of trouble probably, but had a lot of fun in a time where we had to figure things out for ourselves. So I think, thinking about how do you stay open to those options on a good day. Maybe I can do it on a bad day. Maybe I'm less able to pull that together.
Yeah. What helps people see more than just the negative or the blame?
Well, I'm going to think about that idea of a project for self. The other thing I think that I find useful when working with clients and myself, I guess, is that to remind yourself when you're an adult and you're thinking about your relationship with your parents, you are an adult. So one of the things I think about is, I can have different ways of thinking. How long do I want to stay on this phone call? And I can tell my parent what they need to be doing, but I think as a theme you're going to hear this season is the in relationship, what are the actions I can take? Do I want to, if I want to go back and see my family and, my family wants me to stay at their house, I can do some thinking. Is that the best choice for me to stay inside the family home? Or, does it work better for me to stay at a hotel and go see them when I can have an exit? Or, make sure, I have a way to that good Uber account that if I need to get out, I can go take that break. I think that's the part that I find useful is reminding people that they are adults in relationship now with their parents and will have different ways to manage themselves. And what a useful example. I mean, that is, I think, the heart of differentiation is if people can get their thinking clear and hold on to that thinking in relationship, I watch interesting thing happen.
In the present.
In the present, yes. Yeah.
One of the things that I did with my dad's family was I made a list of every stressful event in the family for like 100 years. And that helped me get real objective real fast. They're doing pretty good, right. Maybe I should have included the wins as well, but Dixie, I think that gets to your example with the toothbrush. If it's around a particular topic, you gather the facts, right? And see what people were doing with them.
How do you think your perspective would change if you added the wins on that list?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought. I think it adds even more in favor of people and how they were capable and what they managed to do, right? And that, I think that gets you also out of the sort of the diagnosing of, oh, this family, look at all the troubles they had, they're no wonder.
I think it can also help you see the strengths that came out of those challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So when does it switch from a challenge to a win?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
of how people figured it out.
It's one of my favorite parts about being a curious person, or a family therapist, I was going to say, but a curious person, is just listening to the stories. That's one of the things I've really appreciated about my time in my own family, listening to the stories of challenge and how people do reframe them as, yes, this, my mom has dyslexia, and she could tell that story about the ways it, bogged down her life, but the way she can change it to, her father went and told a teacher that said she could only be a housemaker, that, she was going to figure this out. And I think those ways of looking at that story about challenge and resilience or strengths that come out of that is useful to know.
Yeah. Can I say one more thing?
Of course.
Of course. Yeah.
The only other thing I think that I would add to this is it's useful to pay attention to the triangles that get in the way of developing relationships with parents, because there are a lot of them. I think having your spouse or partner along for a lot of the contact is not helpful. I mean, in the moment, it's helpful because you have somebody complain to about them. Bowen wrote about this, like trying to get your parents one-to-one can be difficult if you have one that most of the contact is through, or often siblings can be your allies or the gatekeepers to the parents. And so there are a lot of people involved that can get in the way of that effort. And so just thinking about what those challenges are and how do you get the one-to-one? Yeah. Because so much of I mean, I'm an only child, so I get less of this, but I think in sort of bigger families, those triangles do exist, and they're certainly hurdles to be creative in getting around if it hasn't been the norm to have that one-to-one with a parent.
Yeah, I thought of that when you said, I thought of people who have parents who have had multiple marriages and that they have relationships with those different partners, and how that really can be an additional challenge to navigate how they access their parent if their parent's partner is less interested in that, or if their parent's partner is very interested in moving in to fill that space that the parent might be less comfortable with. So yeah, that's a really good point, is watching those triangles. And
how quickly it goes to, I'll put your mother on the phone after you've talked to your dad for,
or I'll put my kid on the phone, right? I didn't even mention kids. Like, that's such an easy one, right? So everybody wants to see the grandkids.
Yeah, especially now that there's the picture. I think it's a difference of when I always think about, we had the phone with the long cord when I was little, and I think my mom it was very significantly less exciting to say, talk to grandma on the phone. I'm like, yeah, no, I don't think that's going to happen. But when you see someone and you can interact with them, even a baby can be put in front of the...
That's right.
Yes.
Or the dog.
There we go. Or the dog.
Yeah.
An episode later in the season. Good teaser.
Stay tuned.
Such a good point. So many examples.
Yeah. Do you guys have takeaways that people can think about in their daily life, or resources to look into?
Should I shout out your resource, Kathleen? I think you put in your newsletter is such a useful example, because you ask people such good questions to think about these things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's such a the word I was going to use was non-threatening, but I think just even, I have a colleague who will say, does it shift something in your brain and your nervous system just at the idea of being curious about these things? So when I have a projection on a parent of being a certain way, and I just put the question in my head of, I wonder what it was that got them doing that. I think that in and of itself, it can loosen something up that I think is such a useful resource for people.
And the fact that often this is the default or this is the other focused kind of posture. And here's maybe another option helps me because I'm usually at the default side.
Yeah, I just want to be simple here and say your resource is like your phone. Call your mother. Like, got one.
Yeah.
Can't call your mother. Call your aunt. Call grandma. Call dad. Your uncle. Pay attention to what happens. I have never felt ready to do any of that at any moment. So,
right.
I think people want to maybe do some reading and start to get interested, and if they can, that's great. If I can help people be interested, love it. But I also think the contact helps you be interested too. So, that's an interesting research question. How many calls would it take, or how many trips home by myself? How many people in the family do I need to engage before I start to get interested, in this woman or this man?
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe you never do, but I would bet people do a little bit, so getting back to that Olympic training, like it's tough, and but you learn something. So
yeah. I was going to say my takeaway was always as a goal-oriented person, I found it so useful to create like little experiments. Maybe I'll take your Olympic training and run with it, is just being observant of it. It doesn't even have to be a phone call. Even when I'm texting my mother, like watching what happens in my body, like just being interested how far we can go before I'm like, oh, or just being interested in how well do I keep when I go on a family trip, how well can I keep at some of the goals I set for myself? When do I lose that? What's going on? I just think these little elements of contact give us this laboratory to play around in. And, as I say to myself and others, like, it's not a failure ever. It's always just information that then I get to go, what do I do with that? What do I do with that next thing? I mean, I think because most people are on text right now, text could I always, call your mother. Who uses the phone? I don't even know how that works. I hear from some people nowadays. But like watching your text, I always laugh that, sorry family, but I'm going to say, sometimes I get so interested when I get a text from like a sibling and my mom at the same time. And I think it's just so useful to just track, that process of what's happening in my family when both of them kind of text me about the other person, and thinking about like what's going on there, what happens to me, who do I lean in towards, maybe try a different idea. So I think that that element of contact and setting up those little experiments I find useful.
I often forget that I'm not the only person that might be uncomfortable in some of this contact, that the other members will also have their anxieties with me. Yeah, my takeaway, I think I've already said my takeaway was just the challenge of seeing our parents as humans when we were kids and to this day. But I think, that's getting more objective. And what do you find out?
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I would add, if people have great relationships with their parents, can you think about what's the next frontier? Maybe, it doesn't mean you should talk about anything and everything with mom or dad, but are there interesting challenges, facts about the family, that you haven't touched on? Do you have a great relationship because you have a great relationship, or because you both really like the same baseball team and that's all you talk about, right? Like, there's not a lot of flexibility in that for other challenges. So just think about sort of, even if the water's calm, what's worth sort of getting into, even if it kind of stirs it up a little bit. Because I think a lot of people can say, oh, things are great. That's not something I'm interested in thinking about,
Yeah, I was thinking, I think I said it on an episode with Amy Post, but I think we need to do a episode about how people relate through sports and how it's such a useful I mean, I think that always resonates with me, how many people in my extended system can have a relationship through sports. And I don't think it's a criticism. I just think it's interesting to think about the way that ties people together.
Right. A little differently than politics or sex or religion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast again, Kathleen.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I hope those of you who've tuned in have taken some ideas to be curious as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.